Now settle in, because this particular story, is one of my very favorites. Not because it's grand or tragic or full of noble lessons. No, it's a favorite because it's true in the way that only funny things are true. It comes to us from the gold fields of California, from a place called Angel's Camp, where the mud was thick and the ambitions were thicker. A fellow, our narrator, let's call him a gentleman of some education and very little patience, was sent there on a fool's errand. A friend had asked him to look up a man named Leonidas W. Smiley, a reverend of some kind, supposedly living out in that dusty camp. Well, he asked around, and the name Smiley brought him straight to an old miner named Simon Wheeler, who was dozing in the corner of a dilapidated tavern like a contented old hound. Now, our narrator thought he'd ask a simple question and be on his way. But the moment he mentioned the name Smiley, old Simon Wheeler's eyes lit up like a fire catching dry wood. He backed our poor narrator into a corner, literally, physically, into a corner, pulled up his chair, and began to talk. And Lord, that man could talk. Wheeler never smiled. That's the thing you have to understand. He told his story with the absolute gravity of a man delivering scripture. Not a flicker of amusement, not a wink. Just that slow, steady, rolling voice, like a river that has nowhere particular to be. He wasn't talking about Leonidas Smiley, mind you. He'd never heard of any Leonidas, but Jim Smiley, now there was a man he knew well. Jim Smiley, Wheeler said, was the bet-takenest man in all of Calaveras County. If there was a dogfight, Jim Smiley had money on it. A horse race, a cat fight, a chicken scratching in the dirt. Jim would find an angle. He'd bet you which of two birds would fly off a fence post first. He'd bet on the weather. He once bet on a sick man's chances of recovery, and when the man had the audacity to get well, Jim was so put out he barely congratulated him. He wasn't malicious about it, Wheeler was careful to say. No. Jim Smiley was cheerful and good-natured as the day is long. He just simply could not, let an uncertainty pass without putting something on it. It was a calling almost, a vocation. The strangest vocation the frontier ever produced. Now, Wheeler, bless him, took his time getting to the frog. Because first, there was the horse to discuss. Jim Smiley had a horse. A 15-minute nag, they called her, because she always looked like she was about to expire before she crossed the finish line. Heaving and stumbling and wheezing something terrible. But at the last moment, that old mare would gather herself up like a woman who remembered she had somewhere important to be, and she'd come bursting through the finish line, winning every time. Then there was the small bullpup named Andrew Jackson, unremarkable looking dog. But the moment money was wagered, that dog became a philosopher of combat. He'd go for the hind leg, patient as a saint, and hold on until the other dog simply gave up. Now, Wheeler noted sorrowfully, Andrew Jackson met his end against a dog who had no hind legs, which was a circumstance nobody could have anticipated, and the pup died of a broken heart more than anything. But Jim Smiley's greatest achievement, the crown jewel of all his gambling endeavors, was a frog. A plain, ordinary frog he found down by the swamp one afternoon and carried home in a little box, with ideas already forming in that lively, betting mind of his. 3 months Jim Smiley spent on that frog. 3 months of patient, devoted, almost tender instruction. He named him Daniel Webster, which tells you something about Jim's sense of occasion. And he taught that frog to jump. Not just to jump. Any frog can jump, more or less. But to jump with intention, with commitment, with what you might call artistic dedication. He'd set him on the floor and holler, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And that frog would spring straight up like a church choir hitting a high note, snap a fly right out of the air, and land as neat as you please. He taught him to catch flies on the first try every time. He taught him to spring straight up and come down in the exact same spot. And on distance jumping, Wheeler said, leaning forward with something approaching reverence, Daniel Webster could outjump any frog in Calaveras County, any frog in California. Possibly, Wheeler implied with a slow nod, any frog that had ever lived upon this earth. Jim Smiley was as proud of that frog as a father at a graduation. He'd carry Daniel around in a little latticed box and show him off to anyone who'd stand still, always looking, always watching, for someone who might be willing to make it interesting. And one day, a stranger came to town. A quiet, easy sort of man who didn't seem to know much about anything and said so plainly. Jim Smiley, never one to miss his moment, pulled out the box and offered the proposition. $40, says, my frog can outjump any frog in Calaveras County. The stranger looked at Daniel Webster with the slow, mild curiosity of a man examining a hat he has no intention of buying. I don't see nothing about that frog, he said. That's any better than any other frog. Jim said that was possible, but he'd bet on it all the same. Well, the stranger said he might take the bet, if only he had a frog. So Jim, generous and trusting, and absolutely certain in his frog, set Daniel Webster down carefully in the road, and went off into the swamp to catch a frog for the stranger. And here's where the story turns, friends. Quietly, without hurry, without any particular expression on his face, the stranger reached into his coat, pulled out a small bag, and began feeding Daniel Webster quail shot, spoonful after careful spoonful, right down that frog's throat, until Daniel was sitting there, heavy and full, utterly unaware of his own undoing. Jim came back with a frog, a perfectly ordinary swamp frog, and the contest commenced. The stranger's frog hopped off clean and easy. Jim hollered, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And Daniel Webster, champion of champions, pride of Calaveras County, he heaved. He grunted. He hoisted up his shoulders like a man trying to lift a barn, and he did not move. Sat there as fixed as a doorstep. The stranger collected his $40 with a quiet pleasantness and walked away down the road, and Jim Smiley stood there staring at his frog with the expression of a man whose whole understanding of the world has been quietly pulled out from under him. He picked Daniel up, turned him over, and the quail's shot poured right out. Jim Smiley, Wheeler said solemnly, was the most betrayed man in California. Now, Wheeler paused here, drew a breath, and was about to launch into the tale of Jim's yellow one-eyed cow. And that is when our narrator made his escape. He slipped out while Wheeler turned to answer someone at the door, and he walked out into the cold afternoon air, free. He never did find out about any Leonidas Smiley, but I think, don't you, that he got something far better. A story worth sitting still for on exactly this kind of evening.